Hello and welcome to Minter Dialogue, episode number 457. My name is Minter Dial, and I'm your host for this podcast, a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. For more information or to check out other shows on the Evergreen Network, please visit evergreenpodcasts.com. I'd also like to give a shout out and thanks for putting up a 5-star review for the show to Emily on Apple Podcasts. This week's interview is with Oliver Burkeman. Oliver's a journalist who wrote the long-running column for The Guardian, "This column will change your life." He was the winner of the Foreign Press Association's Young Journalist of the Year award and has been shortlisted for the Orwell Prize. Beyond blogging and his Imperfectionist newsletter, Oliver has also written several best-selling books, including The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking, and Help, How to Become Slightly Happier and Get a Bit More Done. His last book, 4,000 Weeks, Time and How to Use It, Embrace Your Limits, Change Your Life, is a runaway success. We discuss his book, the essence of enough, cosmic insignificance, and how to make the most of your life on this planet. You'll find all the show notes on minterdial.com. Please consider to drop in your rating and review. And don't forget to subscribe to catch all the future episodes. Now for the show with Oliver. Oliver Burkeman, what a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for responding to my request to have you on. I got the idea of this thanks to listening to the wonderful Sam Harris. And what a lovely chat that was. And then the other day I was in an Amazon 4-star store, and lo and behold, Oliver Burkeman, 4,000 Weeks, Embrace Your Limits, Change Your Life, top of the trending books in real life. So bravo.
Very happy
Oliver.
to hear that. Wow, yeah, thank you.
Absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Tell us in your own words, how do you like to describe yourself and the work that you do?
Oh, goodness. I'm an author and a journalist and an author. I don't know, doing less journalism and more authoring these days.
At the Guardian newspaper?
I was for a very long time. I was on the staff of The Guardian for a long time, then on contract. Now I do contribute here and there, but I'm not sort of officially a staff member there or anything.
The world of journalism has changed a whole lot, would you not say?
Certainly has, yeah. Oh, my very earliest days at The Guardian, the internet was there, but it was a terminal in the corner of the newsroom that you could go and use if you needed to be on the internet for 5 minutes, and no one else was on the internet at that point.
So you've written several books, Oliver, and I would imagine that this is the most successful, but I don't know that. 4,000 Weeks, it's a tremendous read. And I have written a few books, I often found myself looking at myself as I wrote the book, and specifically I wrote a book about empathy, because I think that's a core key talent or skill to have in today's world. And then the problem was, I realized that I'm not always empathic, and I need to improve myself. And I was thinking, to what extent, and you did talk about this a little bit on the Sam Harris show, you wrote the book to solve your own productivity delusion.
Oh, I mean, completely. I think the only thing that I pride myself on in this subject matter that you've introduced here is being honest about it. I don't think that I necessarily am more than a step or two ahead on understanding this stuff than the people I'm writing for. I am absolutely not free on a day-to-day basis of the sort of struggles around these areas. I think struggling with them is what makes them of interest to me and makes me a person who can say something useful about them. So yeah, the main thing I really hope I manage in this book, at least on that topic, is just to be open about the fact that I'm writing this for myself as much as for anybody else. I think that's probably true of all books in any kind of advice genre. I just think it's not always necessarily honestly acknowledged by the authors of them. Because you'd think it might detract from I can see how you might think it would detract from the value of a book to sort of admit that you're someone who struggles with this stuff. I actually don't think that's true at all. And as a reader, would far rather read something by somebody who, is invested in that way, instead of somebody who claims to have had it all worked out since.
There's a far greater attraction in imperfection, in authenticity, ultimately underneath, that is what our instincts lead us to, is to say, well, this person is real. They actually, have struggled with it themselves, and that I can relate to. Because if they're a bloody perfectionist and you just got to do this,
Yeah.
well,
So there's two. Yes, you can get two things, ways it can go wrong. One is that somebody has always found something incredibly easy, uh, and that kind of person is not. They shouldn't be writing about that thing. They should be writing about whatever it is that they've struggled with. I try and think of something that I'm just always been naturally good at, like, I don't know, spelling. That would be so boring. I could never bring myself to write.
a spelling bee in the closet.
I mean, that's just not of interest, and it's not of interest, I think, partly because it always came easily to me. And then you get the other problem, which is that people do struggle. An author does struggle with it, but they're not quite being honest with themselves. I'm sure in some ways I'm still being not fully honest with myself, but they're trying to fix their own problems by advising other people, and that's when you get these strange self-help books where people recount sort of having a huge breakdown and a crisis, and then digging themselves out of it by becoming a self-help guru, which always strikes me as a really strange dynamic, because surely what you should do is learn from the crisis and then later become the self-help guru. You shouldn't dig yourself out of a crisis by telling other people how to dig themselves out of a
It gets very meta.
Absolutely, right? Yeah, all sorts of stuff like that. Yeah.
But at the same level, I mean, I read the book thinking that it was that it's about finding yourself too, and at the level that you find yourself, then you can dedicate your 4,000 weeks to that self, as opposed to some sort of other adopted or forced position or self that society, your parents have pushed on you, and you're running down some sort of other path until you find yourself. Then the 4,000 weeks now finally makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I have not tended to think in specifically in terms of, being yourself, being who you were meant to be. Although that is a strong current in the kind of Jungian thinking that has definitely influences this book in part. But I do think, that's just another way, I think, of talking about, like, being in reality, being not spending our lives as we do to such a great extent, trying to emotionally avoid the experience of reality, but facing up to reality. And that is things like how limited time is and the fact that you can't control other people. But it is also things like you have the personality traits that you have, and you have the skills that you have, and you have the struggles and the neuroses that you have. So it is absolutely about sort of being yourself rather than trying to build ways of avoiding that truth. Yeah, I think absolutely.
I detected the Heidegger component of really being in yourself, and the activity of being you is you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for all Heidegger, all the caveats that come with Heidegger, he is in the book, and I think it, as I understand his often impenetrable prose, and the many secondary texts by academics that I relied upon, I think, yeah, there's this. It's pointing to this way. It's a difficult thing to express, but pointing to this way in which we spend so much of our time in one way or another flinching from the way things are and what and who we are, finding ways to feel comfortable instead of authentic. And I think we do that. My focus in the book obviously is the way we do that with respect to our time. All sorts of things that pass as time management advice or productivity advice, I think, are actually ways of sort of cushioning ourselves from the real. And of course, the irony is that the more that you can confront how things are in terms of your limited time, your limited control, all the rest of it, it's actually incredibly empowering. It's not a recipe for nihilism or despair. It's like that's the first step in doing the most interesting and meaningful and exciting things with your life. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
I
think.
see.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely cottoned on to the fact, and I tend to agree with you that the time management processes that we subscribe to tend to focus on the doing. What are you going to do? How quickly can you do it? The efficiencies and effectiveness, and it obviates or doesn't take into account the bigger picture. I mean, oftentimes it sort of gets you focused on the granular
Mm.
tasks that you need to do, which is doing. It's great. You're being you, doing these things. But if you haven't connected into some bigger sense of you, and I kind of felt like when your penultimate chapter about cosmic insignificance, which is something I highly relate to. I was thinking at some level, your book, Oliver, is a call for higher consciousness.
I'll take that. Yeah. No, I mean, I think it is. Yeah, I think that w- there's a there's a thing that I hope I'm doing in the book all the way through, really, which is about making things conscious. So it's less about saying, instead of living your life this way, live your life that way, but it's about saying, notice that these things are unavoidably true about our situation as limited humans. And when you notice that, that is a huge leap, because then you can use what capacity you do have for directing your life and making things happen that you want to happen. You can use it the most fruitfully. So the obvious example is just that, and I'm not the only person to have made this point, every thing you ever do in the course of a day, or with a month or a year, like every choice, every time you do something, you are choosing not to do an infinite number of other things, closing off an infinite number of other possibilities. And there is no option but to choose, and you're already choosing. So when I say things like, when I'm in this book, when I'm talking about, confronting tough choices, I'm not saying there's a way of life that involves not choosing and there's a way of life that does involve choosing. Choose the latter. I'm saying you have to choose. You're already making tough choices with how you use your time, but you weren't necessarily doing it consciously. You weren't necessarily living in that mind space where you see that that's what you're doing, because it's uncomfortable to face up to it, but there are great rewards to doing it more consciously. I hope that makes
Mm.
sense.
Well, it does. I'm following you, Oliver. I love this rabbit hole because well, first of all, I wanted to cite a French saying which follows exactly what you say, which is choisir, c'est renoncer. To choose is to not to choose other things.
Right.
And I absolutely think it's strategic that we need to think about our lives strategically. Otherwise, we just sort of go with the flow. So you do need to act into things. And then this idea of awareness of ourselves, so you can get the sort of understanding of who you are. But just like you were talking with Sam, who I don't know, I just call him Sam. But just like you were talking with him, you're aware, but how aware of you are you? What is it that you're aware of?
Mm-hmm.
The difference between the body, the brain, the mind, and this notion of true honesty, like you were saying at the very beginning. I'm trying to be honest with myself. I'm trying to be authentic, but are we ever 100%? And anyway, what is 100%?
Right. No, I mean, and then there's that paradox about being honest about how you're not being fully honest. I mean, yeah, again, to sort of drag it back to my own particular neuroses and fixations with time management and productivity and things like that, I'm aware all the time, still to this day, of falling into this pattern of thinking that, if I could only wrangle all these tasks, if I could only get to the end of my inbox, if I could only do this, this, and this, that I would achieve some kind of peace of mind that is deeply sort of existential, that is true peace of mind. And I think that notion, which is obviously one of the central ones I'm trying to challenge in the book, that we need to sort of conquer reality in this way in order to feel at peace with reality, and how we never actually will get there. So it's kind of a recipe for constant, ceaseless dissatisfaction. I mean, I find the way it works in my mind now is not that I never fall into that, but that I much more quickly see what I'm doing and
Yeah.
see the old patterns. And there's a lot of freedom in being able to see them, rather than some kind of self-help project of eradicating them completely. I mean, this way of thinking, I think, will be familiar to anybody who has any experience of like sort of longish term therapy, for example. That's what all that stuff is about.
Yeah.
You know, the idea of not sort of, or at its best, I would say, it's about seeing what you're doing and getting freedom from it in the seeing, rather than sort of overnight total personality transformations or anything like that.
It's much like meditation, when your brain goes off, and then oh, my brain has gone off, gone off somewhere.
Yeah, right.
And you feel that moment. That's the magical moment, actually. And you can reel it back. At least you are aware that you went off. Yep. Now you're back, peace, breathing. Oh, go off again. Oh, God, there I am. And it's that capturing the aha back in.
Right.
And so in a lot of what you talk about towards the end, and where I think that's where you refer to Heidegger, but this idea of accepting your finitude, your end. And on the one hand, I also 100% subscribe to this, having been a long-term fan of a rock and roll group called the Grateful Dead, whose absolute philosophy, or one part of their big philosophy, is once you recognize you die, you are grateful for being present.
Right.
And that is absolutely part of their philosophy. And I think that it's a wonderful
about them, but now it makes sense from their name now that you say it.
Yeah, and I could wax on about it, but the idea of your finitude, and I can't help but think that the existential crisis that we have been going through around this world throughout this pandemic is absolutely an inacceptance of our finitude. Wanted you to react to that thought.
You mean the sort of psychological consequences?
Societal.
Right.
Societal, generally speaking, I feel like society has moved to a place where death is something you put away. It's dealt with over there. The old people, let's put them in an old person's home. Death, let's clean it up. Let's not show it. We're scared about it. It's going to trigger people. We're infinite. If we can, we're going to go and transform ourselves with some super hydro therapy, cryogenic, this and that, to live forever. And all of a sudden there's this virus coming around. It turns out it kills people. Oh my God, that's the end of the world. Mm-hmm. Yet we all know we have to die. And I feel like there's a hugely existential component to what's going on. And that lack of accepting, in my opinion, of finitude has been the biggest provocation and challenge we have to face.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I think this is probably truer now at this stage of things than it maybe was earlier on, I think. And I write about the early stages of lockdown in the book, actually, though, sort of not that it was a good time, certainly not, but that there were sort of things that we learned about ourselves in that period of sort of when lockdown was a sort of there was a wide consensus for that, when there was a large sense of sort of gratitude toward frontline healthcare workers, when people were really looking out for their elderly neighbors. There was a moment in that process where I think we were maybe more in touch with our limitations in a way, but yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of this, in terms of some of the ways that I see people sort of I see those ideas now spinning off in less healthy ways. People who I mean, you could see like the great contrast between COVID-0 and learning to live with endemic COVID. You could see in that the distinction between this idea that there could be total human conquest of troublesome organisms that threaten us versus a need to sort of coexist. I think I mean, there's all sorts of stuff is up there, and it's difficult because obviously, this is there are distinctive things about this threat to life. You don't want to sort of say, well, hey, we're off to die sometime, so who cares? Yeah. But on the other hand, I've been really struck by the inability of people on all sides of the political spectrum, it seems to me, sounding superior to them by saying this, but to think in terms of sort of balancing of trade-offs and opportunity costs and upsides and downsides. So on the one hand, you have sort of you have people who I think are wrong to be against the vaccines because there isn't a total perfect knowledge that in 10 years time they won't have had negative effects on us or something. It's like they're good on the basis of the science that we have. On the other hand, the other end of the political spectrum, you have people who seem to think that we have to pursue policies that will bring the deaths from COVID down to zero, even though that leads to deaths from other causes that they're not factoring into their calculations. So I mean, yeah, this idea that everything is a big imperfect mess, that anything we do is going to have a downside, and it's just a question of trying to stumblingly sort of figure out which problems we want to have, and then what that means for the fact that some people are going to end up on the losing side of it. I mean, that whole way of thinking seems very alien to a lot of people. They really want to have extreme clarity, like we should do absolutely everything it takes to eliminate COVID, or we should do absolutely nothing because personal freedom is the only value to consider, and blah blah blah.
Right, very absolutist.
Yeah, yeah.
It strikes me that politics, democracy, is partly, let's say, part of the cause of this, because people in politics are doing that to get elected. Mm-hmm. So there's a time frame, back to this notion of time, that will dictate how I spend my time and what I vote on. And if you say black, I'll say white. Mm-hmm. And if you say red, I'll say blue, because that's what we do. And talk about being on a track that is time bound. And rather than thinking big picture, 4,000 weeks kind of image of politicians, they have to think, well, how am I going to get elected in the next by-election?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that the time aspect of political motivations is fascinating. And yeah, you're absolutely right. It's like, because you don't want to give these people 25-year terms in office, but on the other hand, when you give them short terms of office, those incentives are really warped as well. Yeah.
So in one of the pieces, as I said, I listened to it, so I didn't go back and write down what you wrote, but this is what I think you said, yep. and please correct me and rebuff me and so on. Sure. But you wrote at one point that abandoning hope is liberating. And I was like, whoa, that was really tough for me. I look at hope as a light at the end of the tunnel, as something to push for, as opposed to fear, mm-hmm. which is our predominant thing. But then, as I remember it, you write about, well, actually, it's abandoning hope of ever being in control. Hope that this is just a dress rehearsal, that there is life after death. Is that, qualify me and comment?
Yeah, no, totally. There's definitely this is something that some other people have sort of objected to, and I think there's certainly definitely a semantic issue going on, not particularly interestingly, that hope can mean different things. I think that more substantively what I'm trying to say is that investing all your sort of faith in the future instead of in the present, in thinking that what makes the present okay is that things are heading towards a time when it will be better, is a troublesome way to relate to the present moment. It might be totally forgivable for people, in servitude or deep poverty. There might be forms of it that are just kind of happy, low-key optimism. Nothing wrong with that. Don't want to stop people being optimists. But if you're thinking, the reason that I'm spending my days doing a job I don't like is because I've got this hope that it's going to lead somewhere, that's going to be good. Or if you're thinking, there are all these problems in the world, but the next generation, we can rely on the kids to sort this out later, or something, like anything like that, or the kind of hope that politicians are going to use an awful lot, which is this idea that I can lead you from these dark times to happier ones. It has this effect of, like, a quick Derek Jensen, the environmentalist in the book, you're giving away your power. maybe to some other people, maybe to the government, maybe to the future, maybe to yourself in the future, right? You're taking away from that capacity to say, well, here I am right now. And in some ways, things are going in a good direction. In some ways, it looks like they're going in a terrible direction. And this is what we have. So now let's see what we can do with it.
Well, Oliver, that now I love how you express that, because at the end of the day, something else I often say is hope is not a strategy.
Right.
And what you were talking about, it brings up something that Dan Pink talks about, which feels like having autonomy, so to the agency to be yourself, as opposed to leave it to others, to the wind tomorrow, or to the government to do.
Yeah.
What can you do with your own sense of self around some kind of, hopefully some mastery of some talent to do and achieve and get through the struggle? Because at the end of the day, basically, as I see it, and I think that's something you were talking about when you talk about the challenge of committing to marriage, that it's actually about also not only accepting our finitude, but life is shit and life is full of challenges, and that's what you need to commit to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is this idea of it's this subtle distinction for me anyway between two different senses of acceptance, right? It's not accepting that bad things in your life or your society must always remain that way. It's about accepting that they are that way right now, and not sort of engaging in this inner flinch that has to do with not sort of facing it. And yeah, and then seeing that all sorts of these things are just the inevitable flip sides of they come with engaging in life. I love this. There's a psychotherapist called Bruce Tift who I quote a couple of times in the book, and it's somewhere else, not in the quotes there. He talks about the sort of challenges of marriage and relationship, and to sign up for any kind of long-term relationship, even a friendship, is to sign up for more suffering on some level, because you're becoming vulnerable in the presence of somebody else, so you're going to wind each other up in certain ways. You're going to start to care about this person, so it's not when bad things happen to them, it'll be like a little bit like they're happening to you, and so you've got more sadness in your life. There's all these negatives, but they're completely essential. They're non-negotiable negatives if you're going to get the upside. They just come together. And Tift has this wonderful thing he says about how he never experiences any problems in his marriage now anymore, but only because he doesn't define the experience of emotional disturbance, being wound up, as a problem. He just that's just part of being human. And once you don't see that as a problem, then the fact that your partner is going to press your buttons every day and you're going to be doing the same to them can be seen as just part of two people trying to figure it out. So I think it's really interesting and kind of liberating perspective.
Well, and to be a little bit generalistic, the English aren't known for expressing their emotions a lot, so it could be an uncomfortable place. What's your problem? Your stiff upper lip. Put it back in place, there, damn it.
No, absolutely, and it's tricky to talk about, because I think one of the things that, I don't know if you saw, there was this piece by Heather Havrilesky in the New York Times recently that gave about her own marriage, that gave a very bleak account of it. I think a lot of people miss her tone, and it's not quite as bleak as it seems. But it is difficult, because if you talk about sort of any of these kind of relationship issues, and not only romantic, domestic relationships, I mean all kinds of human relationships, if you talk about the challenges that are involved in them, the temptation is for other people is to say, well, you're just revealing that you've got a bad one, right? And
right.
I don't know anything about Heather Havrilesky's marriage, so I'm offer no judgment. But what's so interesting about this perspective, I think about Bruce Tift, Joseph Campbell talks about this quite a lot. The idea that these upsides and downsides are just all part of engaging authentically with how things really are. I'm thinking also of that talk Alain de Botton gives called "Why You Will Marry the Wrong Person." it's very liberating to be able to talk about it. And I don't think at all that the people who do talk about it are secretly revealing that they're no good at relationships. I think they're revealing that they've seeing the truth about the challenges of these things that you really have to open yourself to in order to get the benefits of them, I think. Instead of, again, this notion, which is there in the time management stuff as well, that we might somehow be able to maneuver ourselves through the right techniques into this kind of godlike status where nothing was ever a problem, and we could do everything without any negative emotions involved.
Yeah, it's for me, it harks back to this notion of imperfection and accepting our imperfections and accepting that having contrary emotions, debate, conflict are part of the messiness of life.
Yes.
And
yes,
that we are striving for performance as we're geared to do at school, to drive for higher numbers if you're a journalist for whatever article you're writing, or book sales, or in business, more profitability. And it's all to what? Well, to get the next number.
right. Yeah, exactly.
And then, but we don't know actually to what it's for. Someone was telling me recently that apparently 50% of recruits at Apple in the United States are now non-college graduates. And they're absolutely doing that on purpose because they think that education is leading us down the wrong garden path.
Interesting, yeah. Which makes you wonder how many people are pursuing those degrees solely to get to places like that. Yeah, no, absolutely. Fascinating.
So in your book, Oliver, you talk about deep time. And this is not a concept I'm familiar with. I love learning about new things. Could you explain to us what you were talking about when you wrote about deep time?
Yeah, I think I am maybe adapting this for my own end. So I don't think anyone should worry about not being familiar with my definition of it, because it may be a little bit customized. But I did borrow the phrase, in my case, from the writer and priest Richard Rohr, who used it in a sort of related context. I think what I mean by that primarily is the sense of being in the flow of time in a way that does not involve the ticking clock, the sense of time running out, the sense of time as a resource that we have to steward, but rather that sort of sense of having successfully kind of entered the stream of time in that sort of full-bodied and full-hearted way. I don't think it's something we can aspire to do all the time. I think we need a standard day-to-day experience of time for all sorts of reasons. But I'm talking about something that I think most people are familiar with, if not from meditation, say, then from being at the birth of a baby, or being at the top of a mountain in the Alps or something. There are all these kind of moments when we talk about things like time standing still. I think that's a legitimate way of talking about it as well. And I sort of sketch out the thought that I think that people in pre-industrial people would have spent, I think there's reason to believe they would have spent a lot more of their lives in this kind of mindset. It's not without its downsides, but I think it's really useful to remember that there is this other way of existing in time. I'm not sure it can ever be finally described properly in words, or whether that's just an excuse for my not having managed to. But that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, timeless time. What it makes me think of, and that's because that's how I roll, it makes me think of psychedelics, right? and how time just is warped, Salvador Dali like. When you are in the middle of it, you're not experiencing time at all the same way,
right,
as maybe like we doing in our work. And I did have this sort of irritation when I was reading it at the beginning. It's good to provoke, right?
Yeah.
There's 4,000 weeks, and like, well, that's great for you, Oliver, but you go along, you don't worry about time. But what about when you meet up with other people? and then finally you come onto this whole piece of synchronization with the world.
Yeah.
I found that sort of a resolution to my challenge with this. You know, you have your 4,000 weeks, but then dealing with the rest of the world. So let's say in your surrounding, to what extent have you shared the 4,000 weeks as a principle of the relationships that you have with others, forgetting the synchronization of other elements? There's more tactical synchronizations of go to a pub and meet people and such like, or listen to the same thing, those elements of community. But to what extent have you sort of, through the book, I'm thinking, grafted a 4,000 week concept that you can share with others to explain how we can be in better sync?
I'm not 100% sure what you mean by that question. So let me answer, and you can please interrupt and steer me into a different direction if I'm not going there. I mean, I think the essence of what I'm getting at in that portion of the book is just that one of the less obvious ways in which we are individually limited with respect to time. And it's obvious that we don't have very much of it in our lives. It's obvious that I think that you know, we seek to do with it more than we ever possibly could. But one of the less obvious ways is that its value comes from being coordinated with other people's, right? If you have total control over how you spend the day, that's not much use if other people are not using it in ways that enable you to sort of have relationships with them, to build businesses with them, to go out drinking in the pub with them, you know, all sorts of things, politics, marriage, child rearing, making money, all of it requires that kind of synchronicity that, you know, there are people who have time for you when you have time for them. And so that's really just the sort of, that's the way that fits into the bigger thing. I do think it's definitely one of the parts that is the biggest personal challenge for me, and certainly it has been one of the more challenging parts of becoming a parent in the last few years, is that sense that you really, and I wrote about this in one of my newsletters recently, you really don't want to adopt an attitude towards time or to your schedule where your 5-year-old son running into the room to tell you excitedly about his day at school, where that is something going wrong with your time management plans, right? I mean, people may have to because they may have certain jobs that they can't break off, absolutely. But like, you don't want to voluntarily think about time as in it goes well if my plan for my day is exactly followed, and it's gone wrong if somebody interrupts that, because a large proportion of the ways in which people interrupt it can be lovely and beautiful, or just useful for work, or all sorts of different things. And that's a perpetual tension for me, because I don't think the answer is to abandon any attempt to plan out the day as I want it to go. I think the way to do this is to be quite exacting and intentional about planning out the day, and at the same time hold those intentions so loosely that that I can give them up if it's the best thing to do to give them up. But that is a hard line to tread, and I'm certainly not going to claim I've got there. I don't know if any of that addressed.
Well, yeah, it does entirely, right? Because at the end of the day, we live with others, and you talk about like child rearing. Well, you know, there's a very important moment where two people need to get together for that to happen, to have the baby, and you know, so there are times, but yet that true, yeah. if you plan that, it can be a little bit less fraught with other challenges. So I used to, specifically with my team, I would say that I only want to have half of my day as a chief executive, want half of my day to be booked in meetings. Right. And I want the other half of my day to be free of meetings. And partly that was because I wanted to have time for strategic thought, time for me, time for shit happens, and time to, hey, listen, I got an idea. To allow for serendipity, which could also include your 5-year-old coming in. Hey, Pa, you know, have you heard about this? And did you hear what I did my day at school? Yeah. And you're not overly stressed. So I think in this, that is time management, because what I'm saying is these are things I don't want to do at some level. I choose to have 50% of my day in meetings, because many people just suffer from meeting-itis, and one thing, you know, just running after there. And they have they just hope that they have time for the rest. They're not actually being explicit about how they deal with it. And the reason why I brought up this sort of whole zone was you talk about the joy of missing out, or this notion of choosing not to do things. And so what I was getting at some level is you have friends who you don't reply to because you've chosen not to spend time doing that.
Right.
And not replying to an email or not replying to a communication because I don't have time for that. Doesn't fit into my 4,000 week philosophy or my gist, and making those harder decisions. I wanted to see how you go through that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's right. I think obviously when you put it like that, it makes me think like, wow, I sound really rude if I'm just sort of if I'm someone who doesn't respond to emails from friends or other things like that. I think, and I do fail to respond to emails from friends for weeks at a time. I think that the point that I'm really wanting to emphasize there is that choices are being made and things are being neglected in your life all the time. That's just a natural consequence of being finite, especially if you're someone with like lots of ambitions and interests for your life. Might be easier if you literally only wanted to do one thing with all your time, but few of us are like that. And that means that, at any moment you're going to be neglecting huge portions of things, missing out on potential experiences, relationships, business opportunities, whatever it might be. And so it's really just a question of, again, becoming conscious that that is happening anyway, that there isn't a way to avoid those losses, those trade-offs, and then you get to make them more consciously, and then you get to do things like, for example, as I talk about in the book, to sort of ask tough questions about middling priorities. Ask about those kind of relationships and activities, hobbies, whatever it is that you don't totally love, but you are doing out of choice, and it might make more sense just to let them slide. And it seems kind of a bit jerkish to think like, well, that one friend who, yeah, it's okay. We meet up every month or two, and it's okay. Like, it seems a bit jerkish to imagine just sort of cutting them loose, and I don't recommend like sending them an email breaking up with them.
Right.
But it's actually no more jerkish, is it, than as a result of that being than the result of having several such friendships in your life, say, being only half present for
when
your
you're with them,
dearest friends, or when you're with them, or or not really having the time for your closest friends or and your loved ones because you 2 nights of every week you're out having drinks with people who you don't particularly care about having drinks with.
Yeah, and that's not good for you.
No,
either.
So something has got to give. And it's just and I think it's often a lot clearer when people are thinking in these terms, it's often a lot clearer that which thing they think should give, because a lot of the time we're struggling to get to that position where nothing has to give. And once you accept defeat in that realm, I think you can do something much more constructive in the realm of possibility and reality. Yeah.
I interviewed someone called Becky Hall, who wrote a book, which I highly recommend, called The Art of Enough. And
sounds great.
And something that you obviously speak about, the essence of enough in your book, and understanding what is my essence, then to be able to qualify, this is a worthwhile activity, this is a worthwhile friendship, relationship.
Yeah.
And I'm prepared to do that. I wonder in the notion of managing relationships like this, what kind of message would you like for people to go about? And this is maybe politically incorrect with regard to relationships, with regard to time management, with regard to where they're working today. Mm-hmm. Would you tell them, stuff what you're doing and really figure out your bigger plan, the bigger essence?
I don't think I'd tell them to stuff what they were doing. I think I'd say, I mean, here I'm borrowing slightly from Sam Harris, who's come up a couple of times, but firstly, I would say, you're not going to get to a point in life where you have no problems, and you probably wouldn't want to get to that point, because some problems are kind of great challenges and they improve you and you get to grow. So given that, what problems could you accept right now in order to do the things that you really want to do? There is if you have a plan for your life that is incompatible with who you're working for now, or who you're in a relationship with now, or something like that, there's already, like, something's already not right about that situation. The idea that you're going to get to a situation where you don't have to deal with any of those losses and you get to do these other things, it's not going to happen. This is coming out a lot less eloquent than I might have hoped, but my basic point would be, I think, we're all waiting, I think a lot of people anyway, we're waiting to begin certain things or to go off on certain paths until, like, all our ducks are in a row, or until the decks are cleared, or until we've fixed ourselves, or until something. And when you see on the most abstract, sort of fundamental level, how none of that is ever going to happen, because that's to do with violating the terms and conditions of being a human being. It's not that you might not improve in certain ways or get the decks a bit more clear or something. It's just that, like, you're just putting something off that for a moment of truth that will never actually arrive. And if you see that, it's suddenly incredibly liberating, because I think then people think, well, okay, maybe now is as good a time as any to do the thing that I think I know I want to do. Just to finally, I guess, to put the same point in different words, this idea of what if you took the thing that bothers you the most about yourself, that you're always trying to change, what if you just accepted that you were going to experience that until the end of your days, never get rid of it? Like, what would that open up? What could you suddenly be like, okay, well, maybe I'm just never going to feel on top of my emails and my work. Okay, so what would it be really great to spend a few hours doing today if I didn't have to think that struggle had any point? I think that's very useful. I think that's really much more interesting than what am I going to do once I get all these things
very liberating
out of the way.
So the last question for you, Oliver, and I'm going to borrow from Heidegger, and I love that whole thing where you don't own time. Time is not something you have, it is something you are. And I wanted you to just react to a statement that I usually use, and to what extent you agree with it or disagree. I've always said that the way you approach time defines you.
Yeah, I think I agree completely. The reason it defines you is because what do we ever do in life except approach time? I mean, they're almost synonymous. How you relate to this moment, but there's nothing outside of that. And so, yeah, I mean, this is why I make the case in the book that this thing called time management, that we have a tendency to think of in such a narrow sense, it's all there is on some level. Now, as you say there, I think also we don't have time, and therefore managing it is a little bit of a misnomer. We are time in the sense that we just exist in time and as time. Wow, this is getting deep. But and it's, you can acknowledge that and take account of all its ramifications, or you can try to shield yourself from it and try to tell yourself that the real time is coming in the future, that if you get everything together, you won't have to be bound by the constraints of time or the limitations of time. So I think, yeah, it's a long way of saying I agree with that. Statement.
Well, speaking of time, your time has come. Oliver, absolute pleasure shifting and chatting about this. Maybe very existential, but I really feel it's something that, whether you're in business, journalist, at school, at all levels of life, it's worth exploring in different ways, of course, because at the beginning you're sort of opening yourselves up to the chakras and the curiosity, and then little by little you whittle down to be a little bit more precise, less hopeful, and more strategic in the way you are. the person you are. So naturally, I want just a last plug. You got your newsletter. How would you like people to, where would you like to push people to get your book? Because I know not all outlets are the same. And or how would you like people to follow you, to sign up for your newsletter?
I am super happy for people to get my book wherever they like to get books. The main thing is getting it. And then my website, oliverburkeman.com, has a bunch of my writing, and that's where you can sign up for my newsletter, The Imperfectionist, as well. Yeah.
And I really appreciated the fact that you did your own Audible. I know what that exercise is like, and it's really fun to listen to the author's voice explaining it. Many, many thanks, Oliver. Tally ho, and I look forward to staying in touch and certainly following what you're up to, because I love what you wrote.
Oh, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having listened to this episode of the Minter Dialogue podcast. If you like the show and would like to support me, please consider a donation on patreon.com/MinterDial. You can also subscribe on your favorite podcast service. And as ever, rating and reviews are the real currency for podcasts. You'll find the show notes with over 2,000 and more blog posts on minterdial.com. Check out my documentary film and 4 books, including my last one, You Lead, How Being Yourself Makes You a Better Leader. And to finish, here's a song I wrote with Stephanie Singer, A Convinced Man.
A stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger. To feel free, trust is the reason. Still I won't toe the line. I sit here passively, hope for your respect, anticipating the thrill of your intellect. Maybe I tell myself there's no use in me lying. I'm a convinced man, building an urge. I'm a convinced man, to live and die submerged. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. I'm a convinced man, challenge my fate. I'm a convinced man, competition's innate. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. Despise revenges and struggle with deceit. Live for the challenge so life's not incomplete. What's wrong with challenge? I know soon we all die. I like the feel of a stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger. To feel free, trust in my reason, and let me show you why. I'm a convinced man, practicing my lines. I'm a convinced man, here in these confines. A convinced man, in the arms of a woman. I'm a convinced man, admit to the test. I'm a convinced man.